What's up, YouTube? I'm Joel Wanasek. I'm a pro mixer and the co-founder of nailthemix.com, one of the coolest places to learn how to mix heavy music on the internet. And today I want to do something a little different. Normally I've been doing a lot of mix breakdowns and reactions and, dissecting some of my favorite mixes and trying to help you guys, hear things in a different light. But one thing I've always done at URM Academy is I've always done like rants and Q&As and things like that. And a lot of people seem to really like it. So I want to give it a try here and see how it goes. Because when it comes to mixing professionally, a lot of people that are younger or newer to the game, I should say, not necessarily younger, but newer to the game, they focus on techniques and tools and things like that. And as you get older and more successful and, your world expands in mixing, what happens is your mentalities change and the things that you think that are important at certain points in your career are not important at later points of your career and things like that. So we can sit here and talk about clickbait techniques like, oh, put this on your snare and this and this and that, or sidechain this to that. That stuff's all great and that stuff's all fun, But philosophically, I've always put a lot more weight on those types of topics because while, it's not as exciting as sidechain compression or using Soothe as like a ducker on your thing, you know what I mean? Like it's not as exciting as that for a mixer. This is the stuff that if you take the time to really dig into and really, really think about it, it's going to make a massive difference in your own personal world. So I want to talk about something philosophical today. So bear with me. Let's see how this goes. But I want to talk about a concept that has been floating around in my head that I've kind of wanted to verbalize. And I've talked about this on Instagram, but I want to talk about the different levels of mixing. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, this is a broad topic, but to sum it up, I think about mixing as kind of like a never-ending video game, all right? But as you play the game, right, it's like one of these app games where the game unlocks once you hit certain levels, and then, you get a whole new gaming experience. And I kind of feel like that's what it's like mixing, right? Because again, I've been doing this professionally for over 20 years. I've worked with absolutely iconic artists all the way down to, the smallest startup projects in a basement. I've been anywhere and everywhere and in between, and I've seen it all at this point. And, I'll be continuing to do this professionally for quite a long time. So because of that experience, I've realized that usually in learning, what happens is you kind of have different stages and revelations where, you're working really hard. It's not like it's not like walking up a hill. It's kind of like taking jumps up a step ladder, right? So, you're working really, really hard. It doesn't feel like you're getting better. And then all of a sudden you just have a revelation. And suddenly in a very short period of time, like the level of your work goes up substantially. And then, you're grinding it. You feel like there's no progress. Maybe you feel like you're even getting worse and you get frustrated. And then what happens? Well, then you suddenly have a breakthrough. And in a very short period of time, you're doing much, much higher level work. And as you go through those breakthroughs, your mentality changes and things like that. So, I've been going on about this levels of mixing thing, and I just really want to dive into this. So I think it's important to understand that mixing is kind of like I said, a video game. All right. As I stated a little earlier. What I mean by that is like, if you think the game ends at level 20, right? So if you're playing for some years and you get good and you get to like level 18 and you're like, yeah, the game maxes out at 20. I'm really great at this. When you hit level 20, what happens? All of a sudden now the game unlocks and goes to say 35 and you're playing with level 34 players and 35 players and 32 players. And you're sitting there on level 20 and you're like, oh my God, I'm getting smoked, like I'm not as good as I thought. And your whole world view changes because this types of skills and mentalities and the mindset needed to get from 0 to 20 is very different than what it's going to take to get from 20 to 35. So then you work really hard for a while and you get to like level 35 and now all of a sudden the game unlocks to 50 and you're like, oh my, this is crazy. This is like a totally different ball game, so you're sitting there re-strategizing, rethinking everything that you think, and your thinking just changes, your skills change, etc. And then you get there, boom, the game unlocks to 80 to 100. The point is it's endless, right? Even the best mixers in the world, the people that are just absolutely iconic, are learning stuff every day. I'll give you an example. I was talking to legendary David Bendeth. We were just talking about some great old mixes that he did that I loved, and I was just like, I really think that, the Under Oath mix that he did, Lost in the Sound of Separation, like that record is just incredible. And I've always loved the sound of it. And he's just like, man, I'm so much better now as a mixer. It's cool for me to go back, but he's like, I wish I could, redo it because I could do it even better. And, he's growing. So the point is even when you think somebody's at the top, there's always another level. You could be in the top 10% of the world, right? In terms of your skills at something. But in that 10%, there's 100% range between how good people are. You can get to the top 1% even. And even in that top 1%, there's 100% there of, range from the person that's number one and everybody else, right? So that's something to think about philosophically. Okay, so now that you understand that and think about that for a second in terms of mixing, because what I'm trying to do here is kind of help you no matter where you are at your career, like if you're a seasoned pro or if you're a beginner or somewhere in between or aspiring, it doesn't matter. The point is understanding and thinking about this sort of thing and reflecting on it in your own work will help you make better decisions and understand your trajectory professionally. Again, this is not something I feel like a lot of people are going to talk about because it's abstract, it's philosophical, it's kind of high level in terms of, it's not a clickbaity thing. But this is the kind of stuff that I think that has a lot of value. Okay, so in terms of understanding that you're going to go through different levels of progression, and on each one of these levels, you need to understand that you're going to completely have to change your thinking and value in terms of like what's important to you when you're creating art, mixing, right? To progress to the next level. It's kind of like talking to somebody in their 80s. They have a different view on life than somebody in their 20s or in their 30s or their 40s or 50s even, right? So as you get older, you get more experience in life and you get, not necessarily, knowledge, of course, but wisdom, right? So it's kind of like the same thing, right? You get that wisdom. So what are some of these different levels? And I've been thinking about this, and this is like a really hard thing to break down, in my opinion, and give like specific things because we're talking about something that's, constantly changing. There's a lot of variables to it, but I think I can knock out a couple of solid choices here of things that you can kind of think about at maybe different stages. Okay. And that will kind of help you progress and prepare your brain to start thinking about these things earlier so you can get to a certain spot and then realize like, where do I go next? Right. So in the very beginning, right, let's start out at the bottom of the ladder. When you're learning to mix, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. Again, because especially if you go on like YouTube and you see all this clickbait stuff and you're like, oh, well, my mixes suck because I didn't put saturation on everything. And then you saturate the crap out of your next mix and it sounds terrible. And then you're like, okay, well, I saw that I need to sidechain my bass to my kick. That's the trick that's going to make me great. So you go and you sidechain your bass to your kick. And then what happens? Your mix isn't that much better. And you're like, what? And you go through all of these stages and you try all this stuff. When you're starting out, my opinion, I think that it's most important to focus on just two simple things. Okay. Because if you don't, you're going to get overwhelmed and you're going to develop bad habits and you're going to think you need to do all this crazy stuff because you see people go and they mix that are pros and they'll have like 8 plugins on their chain or all this crazy analog gear and a board. And that's a lot of stuff and a lot of systems of things that work together. And you're trying to sit there and peck out one little thing to do that is going to be like that major stepping stone for you. And the reality, it's the whole system. It's not just one little thing. So in the beginning, I think in order to not get overwhelmed, what's really, really important is to start off and just focus on balance. Because honestly, like 99% of mixing is balance, if not all of it. Think about it for a second, like volumes, right? The most important thing in emotional impacted music, fader balance, right? Volume is everything in terms of like, the kick drum versus the bass or whatever. But EQ is just balance, but across different frequency levels. So you're balancing the top end versus a point in the mid range, or, it's just gain, it's just volume, right? And the same thing holds true for dynamics. Well, dynamics is just controlling volume, using an expander versus a gate versus a compressor versus a limiter, a slow attack, fast release, medium release, et cetera. All of these different things adjust volume differently. So almost everything in mixing is volume. So when you're starting out, I think just open some songs and just practice balancing fader. So if I turn up the drums against the guitars, how does that make me feel? How does that make the song feel? If the drums are really loud against the guitars, and then maybe go listen to some of your favorite mixes in a genre similar to the song that you're mixing. But what happens if you take the guitars and bring them up really loud, or if you're mixing like EDM, if the synth's really loud, or like the 808 in trap, or really, really loud versus the kick drum, or the kick drum really loud versus the 808, or the hi-hat, or, et cetera. So when you take these different elements and you move them around the spectrum in terms of volume and balance, what's going to happen is you're going to feel different ways about something. You know what I mean? You're going to go and reference, you're going to hear how other people are doing it. And if you don't have the right balance, the song isn't going to jive. So focusing on that and getting good at that, and then learning the basics of EQ. Okay. And EQ, I think, can be boiled down to something really simple. Because EQ is very complicated, but it doesn't need to be. Because at the end of the day, you're doing basically two things. You're listening to a sound, you're diagnosing it, you're fixing it, you're comparing it, but you're like, essentially, does a sound need to be brighter, right? Or darker? Meaning more treble or less. So, starting with EQ shelving, forget all that parametric stuff, just shelves, brighter, darker. Or does it need to be thicker or thinner on the bottom end, right? So when you listen to a sound, you're like, yeah, this sound sounds kind of thin. Okay, well, let's thicken the bottom end. Oh, this sound sounds really, really muddy and bass heavy. Well, I could brighten it or I could reduce the bass, and you can listen to both of those and you can decide which sounds better in context in your mix. So if you just start out with shelving and things like that, this to me is like the very basic level. It's just learning, balance, basic EQ and things like that. As you move up the scale a little bit, obviously, so we go a level up. I know I spend a lot of time on that level, but like, I'm going to start going through this a little bit faster, but it's important to start with the fundamentals because everybody wants to gloss over them because they're not as exciting as parallel compression or parallel saturation, sidechain, like it doesn't have the same shock factor, but it's more important. And the older you get in terms of experience, the more that you gain or the more you realize that. Okay, so as you move up these levels now, you start learning these different techniques and tools. So in the beginning, right, let's zoom out. All right, in the very beginning, it's about techniques. It's about learning and becoming fluent with you being able to express yourselves. Because if you ask a pro, how do I make my snare awesome? You're like, well, I can think of like 50 different ways I can mix this snare. I could saturate it. I could parallel compress it. I could, EQ it. I could sample it. I could sample reinforce it. I could use some kind of, expander trick on my overheads to pop up my snare. There's like a million different techniques that you can do as a pro. So when you're learning, right, the next level up from being a beginner is just learning to master these different techniques and learning to go in and to find different ways of doing things and experimenting and things like that. I think after that, maybe we move into a phase where, this is a process that takes years, but what happens is you start transitioning into a space of, maturity in your mixing where you start to focus more on not necessarily techniques. Okay. Because like, let's jump up some levels. Like a pro, for example, the difference between like, let's just say CLA, TLA, and Andy Wallace. Like we know that every single one of them can compress. Every one of them can EQ. Every one of them can sidechain something. Every one of them can adjust a fader, right? So what's the difference? Okay, well, the difference on a higher level is how they interpret the song, how their signature sound, right, makes somebody feel. How you see where I'm going. Like that's a different set of skills because again, as you get high up in the game, you're not thinking about, oh, this snare sounds weak. Well, I don't know what technique to fix it. My snare doesn't sound right. When you're a pro, you're just like, okay, this is wrong. Try that technique. Nope, this. Like you immediately know the path. You can look at the blank canvas, you can see the painting, and it's just an issue of taking the brush and putting the paint on the screen. So it doesn't matter what the problem is, right? As you get more experienced and a higher level, you're easily able to solve those problems. So then you're like, okay, because I've got some sort of technical mastery of this, right? Then it becomes about things like emotional connection for the song. Like, how does the song feel? What is the best feel for the song? What is the emotion? Like what kind of sonic palette do I need to paint as a mixer to make this song come to life? And maybe 4 other mixers are in that mix-off all trying to do the same thing. And one person might have better drums, might have better guitars, one might have a better vocal, but one person might just paint the song put it in a frame, you know what I mean? Where the song just feels like a song and you hit play and you stop listening to the mix and you just connect with it emotionally and you just listen. And that's the person that's going to win. So as you go up the ladder, I think it's important to recognize that the tools and the techniques are a given, right? Like that's something you've taken the time at an earlier point in your career to master. They say it's 10,000 hours to become great at something. I think mixing is easily like 15 to 20,000 hours. You know what I mean? It's very, very, very insanely hard skill to get good at a high level. I've been mixing over 20 years and, I feel like even in the last year, I've made quantum leaps in terms of like my mentality and things like that and the way that stuff. So, there's always room to grow. Like every week, every day, I'm learning something. You know what I mean? And I just think like, imagine extrapolating that when I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm going to think about all this. It's kind of mind blowing. It's important to realize that at a certain point, like emotional connection, that's what matters. What matters is getting the right fader balance, picking the right sound for the thing. Another thing is a lot of people don't think about this in lower levels, but at a high level, you're worrying about how well are my mixes going to age, right? Like how timeless is it going to be? If I go back and listen to something from 10 years ago, does it still sound sick and competitive today? I'll give you an example. Metallica's Black Album. If you watch any of my mix reactions, I've hinted at this and talked about this a lot, but certain records, like when you listen to them, like Metallica's Black Album still crushes and destroys and sounds insane next to anything modern, even though the techniques now are way fancier. The tools are way crazier. We have all these possibilities in the DAW that they didn't have back then. But when you listen to it, it hits like few things now hit. All right. Because they understood at the time what was important in the mix and the song, and that certain tools they used had a certain sound. So I think about that all the time when my own work. I'm like, if I use this sim on my guitar, is it going to sound dated in 10 years from now? If I use this type of approach on this, is it going to sound dated? Is it going to hold up and still sound great? Are people still going to connect with that song? So at a higher level, you're thinking about things like that. Like how well is the work going to age? Not just how does it sit in the market now, across the charts, like in the top 40, is it going to hang? Is it competitive with all those mixes? What's my edge? What am I doing a little bit different that makes it sound unique, et cetera? What's my sound? What's the artist's sound, et cetera? Like what's the marriage of that? Not only that stuff, but on a higher level, how timeless is that sound going to be? Is it going to age well? That's so important because, again, how many people are thinking about that in mixing? I feel like most people, and having taught so many thousands of people around the world mixing, most people are mixing, thinking about like, how do I get my snare drum to sound good? What's the right amount of 200 to boost in it, right? Zoom way out. A better question you should be asking is this going to age well? Is this going to be timeless? And I understand it takes a long time to get to a level where you can start thinking about that, you know what I mean? And putting out stuff at a competitive level, because if you're mixing and you can't even you're referencing stuff and you're just like, there's no way I can get to that level. Like this mix is just crushes mine. And you're sitting there scratching your head. You're thinking about that. Well, obviously that's out of the scope, but like I said, I'm trying to just help prep you for what's coming, depending on where you are in your career, of course, and giving you some food for thought to think about and some things to really kind of just like soul search. Because again, it may not be applicable to you now, depending on what level you are, but being aware that at some point you're going to have to think about that's important. Another one I think that's very, very important to learn at a higher level is the emotional impact that tools have. Okay. And this is something that really frustrates me because, when I see people that are not super experienced go out and comment on something like it's the absolute law, and a lot of times they're just regurgitating what they saw somebody else said, but they really don't understand the difference because their hearing hasn't really evolved to that level. It concerns me. It concerns me deeply because we're not listening. We're not listening. We're not learning to listen. I'll give you an example. Like if you watch my As I Lay Dying one with Colin Richardson, I talk about what makes that one of the best metal mixes history, the way it jumps out of the speakers, like the tone, the energy of that mix and the depth to it. There's certain things that you need to learn to listen through because they're not so trendy because we're using different tools. I think that it's interesting to me is the effect that equipment, all right, both digital and analog has on a sound in terms of a sonic signature. And using those sounds to combine them, to certain things combine better with others. It's just like having different spices in your soup kitchen, is going to affect the emotional impact of your stuff. Now, if you're mixing 100% in the box, you're probably scratching your head like, I don't understand that at all. But if you've ever mixed on a console with a bunch of outboard and you've spent some real time in a room comparing that stuff, you can hear the difference because it's very apparent, but you've matured with your hearing to be able to hear the difference. You're going to know exactly what I'm talking about because the way things feel changes when you use equipment, which is crazy because if you think about it, we got like two speakers in front of us, right? And they're just going back and forth. But the way that's handled can send chills down your spine or not, depending on how you do it. So one thing that I think is interesting, and I'll tell a bit of a story here. I was doing a master for an artist, and the artist is into mixing. And I sent it over, and the artist was like, hey, this master sounds great, but I think it's a little saturated. And I said, oh, okay. So let me do something. I'm not going to tell you what I did, and I'm going to send you a second master, and I want you to just listen to them. And then I sent that master, and I did it totally with digital tools instead of hardware tools. Because the hardware master, I maybe used like a 2BQ and maybe a compressor or something. I don't remember, but I used something that adds something. I said to the artist, I'm like, I don't want you to listen in terms of technical things. All right. That's like lower level listening, right? Sitting down and listening to like, is the snare drum good? Do I like the cymbals? I mean, that stuff's important, but at a higher level, how does this make me feel? Do I feel like I'm in the room with the artist watching them play? Or do I feel like I'm looking at a picture of that or a recording of it? So I said to the artist, I said, listen, I want you to sit down, close your eyes and listen to these two masters. And I want to know which one of these makes you connect with them. I want to know which one makes you feel better about it, makes you feel like you're sitting in the room. Because when I listen to these two, here's the difference. The EQ curve mathematically is almost the same. The amount of distortion on it, whatever. I'm sure if we spec'd it out and measured it, it'd be pretty damn close. But the difference is one of them, when I listen to it, makes me feel like I am sitting right next to you on the bench, listening to you sing your heart out, playing the piano, just emotion flowing. I am there in the room with you. And the other one, for whatever reason, right, makes me feel like I'm listening to a recording of that. And then the artist was like, the light went on. And they were like, wow, you're right. Like the level increased, they got it. So the point is that different tools have different sounds, just like different plugins. For example, there's a lot of like 4000 SSL plugins. If you use a Waves 4000 versus a Brainworks 4000 versus a UAD versus the SSL, they all have a little bit of a different sonic signature. And if you put the same EQ moves on each one of them and you drop them in, now, of course, we can't, it's hard to say that they all measured the same and they spec out the same. So let's get rid of the technical stuff. That's not what we're here for. But I want you to think about this philosophically, like that you will hear a difference in sound because there's different saturation modeling, or lack thereof. Maybe the EQ curves are different. But the point is each one of those plugins is going to have a different sound. Just like if you take the best 4000 plugin and I have a hardware 4000 strip in front of me, right off a console racked. And when you insert that piece of equipment, it changes how something sounds. It gets like 20 or 30% wider. And as a way of sitting in the space, because if there's like a saturation that it adds, you AB to the plugin, you'll hear it immediately. You'd be like, whoa, because it's the exact same thing. So you can set it to the exact same things. Like when you take the EQ and you go plus 15 on the hardware, it bends, it distorts, it crunches up in a nice musical way. When you go 15 dB on the plugin, it gets harsh. Now, some of the new plugins have this, nonlinear modeling, and I understand this stuff to a certain degree. I'm not a coder, but I do own a software company called DrumForge, and I have made enough plugins and I have talked about modeling enough with programmers to get a basic idea. And you can model this stuff, but again, the point is it's different. So it's important to understand that different tools have different sounds. And as a painter, you can pick if you're going to paint with oil-based paint or water-based paint, or you're going to mix them, or I don't know, I'm not a painter, but you know what I'm talking about, or crayons, or, Sharpie markers, or just regular washable markers. Every one of those is going to have a different look on a canvas than everything else. So, at a higher level of mixing, you are going to find a set of tools that sound flattering to your ear, whether they're digital, whether they're analog, it doesn't matter. The point is you need to find your sound, because every mixer, and people have argued with me on this on Instagram, but every great mixer has a sound. And if you've listened to enough of their work, you will immediately recognize it because it's the tools they use. It's the type of balances, the type of compression they use, the way they EQ, it's a combination of a lot of different things. It's hard to break down technically, but at a very high level of mixing, that person is a painter and they have selected their tools that they operate in. And then all of the music they work on comes through that funnel, right? And comes out with that imprint on it. So, if you're using a certain set of plugins, like for example, if you put Soothe on every channel, it's going to have a certain sound. If you don't use Soothe on every channel, it's going to have a certain sound. If you use a 4000 Brainworks plugin, it's going to have a certain sound. If you use an SSL origin console or an API console or a Neve console, it's going to have a different sound. And the question is, because we're dealing with art and it's subjective, question for you is, what's your sound and developing it? So at a very high level of mixing, I think it's important, something that you think about is, what is my sound, right? And how can I find, through my framework, the artist's sound and make it unique and something that stands out and something that's going to be timeless and something that's going to have an emotional impact on somebody, and that's going to inspire them when they hit play, and they're going to love that song, fall in love with it, and stay in love with it their whole life. That's what we're all trying to do. So I'm going to leave it there. I know that's a lot of philosophical mumbo jumbo, blah, 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 blah. But again, my goal here is to teach people real mixing. Okay. It's not to give you like techniques and stuff like that, because there's plenty of good ways to learn, nailthemix.com. We'll teach you all the techniques you could ever want to learn forever. I'm here today because I want to talk about some things that you may or may not be thinking about philosophically that hopefully you've gained some value from. So if you like this kind of content, drop me a comment below. Let me know what you think. Please click subscribe and like and the notification bell. And of course, if you like, tactics, tips, philosophies, things like that, talking about mixing, please follow me on Instagram and TikTok. It's at Joel Wanasek. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this very long rant about the levels of mixing. Have a great day.